She knocked only to survive. He pulled open the door merely to escape another night of silence. But destiny had other plans. Annabeth Rowan and Silas Mercer were strangers bound by loss until hardship forced them together, not just survivors, not just protectors, family. The wind screamed through Frosthaven Ridge like a wounded beast. Snow slashed sideways across the fading dusk, devouring every tree and hollow in its path. No trails, no markers, just white upon white upon white. Annabeth Rowan pulled her tattered shawl tighter across her shoulders, though the thin fabric did little against the gnawing cold that burrowed into her bones. Behind her, 3 small figures trudged in silence, heads bowed, faces hidden beneath worn caps and ragged scarves. Daniel, the eldest at 11, clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached, determined not to let weakness show. Ruth, just 8, clung to his sleeve, her steps stumbling more with every frozen breath. And Matthew, tender Matthew, barely 5, whimpered softly as he clung to his mother's skirts, his mittens stiff with ice. Annabeth's legs burned as if fire licked her muscles. Her lips split each time she whispered for them to keep going. She didn't know how much farther they could last. She wasn't sure she herself would make it, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Not after Thomas, not after the cruel words he'd spat as he rode away, abandoning them in Hollow Creek with nothing but a half-empty sack of flour and a sneer. The storm dragged at their boots, swallowing them ankle-deep, then to the calves, until each step became a battle against the earth itself. Annabeth kept her gaze forward, though all she could see was a sheet of blinding white. She told herself there must be something ahead. Someone, a barn, a hut, a lamp glowing in the night. Anything, but her faith faltered with every ragged breath. Time twisted and lost shape. Minutes stretched like hours, hours folded into eternity. The storm erased all sense of distance. Matthew collapsed first, his small body giving way to exhaustion. Annabeth dropped to her knees, pulling him close, rubbing his arms, whispering frantic pleas for him to stay awake. Her tears froze on her cheeks. Ruth began to sob. Daniel bit down hard on his lip, fighting the same despair clawing at his chest. Then Daniel saw it, a flicker through the snow. He raised a shaking hand and pointed. Annabeth blinked through the storm, her heart lurching as she caught sight of a faint glow, yellow, alive, a promise, a cabin, shelter, salvation. With one last surge of will, she lifted Matthew into her arms and urged the others onward. Just a little more, she rasped, though her voice was more air than sound. Each step was agony, but the glow grew until at last it became real. A cabin pressed against the pines, smoke curling from its chimney, a lantern swinging gently beside the door. Annabeth staggered to the porch, lungs raw, arms trembling under Matthew's weight. She lifted a fist and knocked. The sound was feeble, lost in the storm, so she struck again, harder, desperation in every blow. The wooden door creaked open. A man filled the frame, lantern in one hand, its light carving shadows across his weathered face. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a patched coat, a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. Silas Mercer had not expected anyone. Not here, not now, not in this storm. For a moment the world held its breath. The gale howled behind them, the fire flickered within, and in the threshold stood a widow and 3 frozen children. Annabeth's lips parted, but only a cracked whisper escaped. Please, for the love of God. Silas's eyes lingered on the boy in her arms, then on the hollowed cheeks of the others. He was a man who had chosen solitude, who trusted no one, who carried loss like an unhealed scar. Yet something in him shifted. Without a word he stepped back, raising the lantern, and allowed them inside. Heat wrapped around them like a miracle. The hearth glowed with a small but steady fire, its smoke curling through the rafters. Annabeth lowered Matthew onto a faded rug, rubbing his limbs as Ruth huddled against her, and Daniel collapsed onto a bench. She swayed but forced herself upright. "Thank you," she breathed. Silas shut the door against the blizzard, set the lantern down, and stood watching them, the widow, the children, intruders in his fortress of solitude. His cabin was no palace. Rough beams, pelts hanging along the walls, a table scarred by knives, shelves of jars and traps. Yet to Annabeth and her brood, it was a cathedral of warmth. That night, as the storm raged, their lives were bound together in silence and firelight. Annabeth had lost everything. She had been raised in Hollow Creek, married Thomas Rowan young, and believed in his promises. But Thomas was restless, chasing riches across Red Rock Valley, gambling away his fortune, leaving debts in every town. When winter bit hard, he left her with children and dwindling food. She had begged him to stay, to think of Ruth, of Daniel, of little Matthew, but Thomas had only laughed, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the snow. That was the last she saw of him. Silas, too, carried ghosts. Years ago he had a family, a wife named Eleanor, a daughter who would have been close to Ruth's age now, but fever had swept through Ashwood Hollow and claimed them both. Silas buried them under the tall pines and swore he would never open his heart again. He traded with townsfolk when forced, but mostly he lived alone, his only companions the crackle of fire and the distant howl of wolves. Now fate had placed Annabeth Rowan and her children on his doorstep, and though he told himself it was temporary, that they would leave when the storm passed, something deep inside whispered otherwise. The days stretched on. The blizzard did not relent. Annabeth helped where she could, mending torn shirts, cooking what little food remained. Silas taught Daniel how to split wood, guided Ruth in feeding the fire, watched Matthew laugh when warmth returned to his small body. Slowly the silence that once pressed heavy on the cabin grew lighter. The sound of children's voices filled the hollow spaces in the rafters. Annabeth's quiet hum soothed the nights. But hardship was never far. The food dwindled. The storm cut them off from Frosthaven Ridge for weeks. Wolves prowled near, their howls chilling the night, and whispers spread through Red Rock Valley of desperate men, drifters who robbed cabins, stealing whatever they found. Silas stood guard each evening, his rifle across his knees, staring into the snow-laden dark. Annabeth would sometimes rise from her bedroll, wrap a shawl around her shoulders, and sit near him in silence. They rarely spoke, yet in that silence an understanding grew. She came to see the grief etched in him. He came to recognize the fierce strength in her. Together, unspoken, they began to hold the fragile shape of something that looked like hope. One night, when the storm finally broke, footsteps crunched in the snow outside the cabin, not the light tread of deer, heavy, purposeful. Silas rose, rifle in hand. Annabeth pulled the children close. 3 men appeared from the tree line, their faces gaunt, their eyes sharp with hunger. They demanded shelter, demanded food. Silas stood firm, his voice low but steady, warning them back. But the men laughed, circling like wolves. It might have ended in blood had Daniel not stepped forward, clutching a piece of wood like a weapon, standing between them and his mother. That single act, a boy's defiance, shifted the air. The strangers sneered, muttered curses, and slunk back into the dark. Afterward, Silas's hands shook as he lowered the rifle. Annabeth placed her hand lightly on his arm. No words were needed. Trust had been sealed, through trials of fire and frost, through hunger and fear. What began as chance shelter became something deeper. Silas taught Daniel to track and trap, showed Ruth how to sew leather, lifted Matthew onto his shoulders when the boys' laughter filled the trees. Annabeth cooked meals from whatever they scraped together, told stories by the fire, and slowly, imperceptibly, the grief lines on her face softened. Silas Mercer, once a man of silence and loss, found himself looking forward to the sound of Ruth's questions, to Matthew's giggles, to Daniel's stubborn determination. And most of all, he found himself watching Annabeth, the way she moved with quiet strength, the way her eyes still shone despite everything she had endured. What began as survival became kinship. What began as strangers became family. By spring, when the ice broke from Hollow Creek and wildflowers returned to Ashwood Hollow, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge of one man. It was home, their home. Silas had opened the door that night merely to let in the storm. Instead he had let in love, and from that night forward neither Annabeth Rowan nor Silas Mercer nor the children ever walked alone again. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below.